to welcome you to this somber yet significant moment in English history. And I think it's great timing that we're actually fairly close to the date. I was trying to work it out, but my eyesight's deteriorated, so I can't read the day of the month on my watch. But I think it's on Friday, the 15th, or Thursday, Friday or Thursday. So you can celebrate that or commemorate that as you think appropriate. So the execution of Charles I obviously is an important wolf. That's appropriately dirgeful. Is a significant moment in English history, and an unprecedented one. And I think we can say that not only is this the first time in English history that an anointed king was executed by order of Parliament. As we'll see, English kings don't always have an easy time, and a few of them are neat, nasty ends one way or the other. But this execution by order of Parliament for treason was very new and unprecedented. And I think we can safely say it's an event that's quite unlikely to be repeated, no matter what the next heirs to the throne do or what shenanigans they get up to. So the fact that it is an unprecedented event is reflected in the term regicide, which is from the Latin word, the murder of a king, which is often used in the singular to refer to it in English history, the regicide, as though there can be no other event but the execution of Charles I that's being referred to. So the subsequent Republican experiment, which was brief, it lasted only 11 years or so, was nonetheless profound in its consequences. It left a lasting and indelible mark on the English psyche. And this is one of, I think, this lecture will try to illustrate the extent to which historical memory is very important in shaping events. And you're all familiar with the cliche that the historians tend to hate, which is history always repeats itself. And this is, I think, a good example of the way in which the memory of an event shapes subsequent events in a way that ensures that history does not repeat itself. So that's something I'll get back to in a minute. So on a very obvious and simple level, and this is, of course, as historians, where we always should remember that we shouldn't overlook the obvious and simple, the starting place. This was a traumatic and really a momentous event insofar as it profoundly upset what it was believed to be the divinely ordained social order, the so-called Great Chain of Being, which was a belief very current in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period, and it extended really into the 18th century and arguably beyond, that God himself had placed every creature in the cosmos in his or her place for a reason. And so it was a reason that could not be questioned. If you were a poor scullery maid, you had to accept that cheerfully because it was God's will. Or if you were the king, that was a burden that similarly had to be embraced as divine will. So to many contemporaries, the notion of overturning that order, of human beings making a decision that upset that divinely ordained order, was profoundly troubling in its implications. So, according to medieval theories of kingship, the king was more than just a man, but he was rather the symbolic and immortal and eternal embodiment of his entire kingdom. So he was both an individual man and an immortal in some sort. And that I think reflects a very deeply ingrained precept in the Middle Ages, and they were used to this concept when they talked about Christ, for instance, being man and God. So this notion of duality is quite familiar both to clergymen and to statesmen, and in fact to all subjects. So this concept of the king's two bodies, the idea that the monarch is both an individual man and sort of a mystical embodiment of his people, is reflected in the frontispiece for Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, which interestingly is published really out of the English Civil War and just after the regicide, and I don't think that's a coincidence, especially as it powerfully reinforces this idea that the king is God's anointed on earth. So you see here that, and this is an analogy often used, and you're probably familiar with this at all, the body public, the body politic, as an actual body, with the king being its head. And the subjects being received, this looks like a suit of armor, but it's really a kind of roiling mass of these subjects. And there all kinds of analogies are made. You know, the workmen are his feet, the clergymen are his arms, and so on and so forth. So this is a very current belief. And it's also reflected in the famous expression and this belief that the king never died, and as his authority passed unbroken to his successor. Hence the famous expression that you're supposed to call out after the death of the king is dead, long live the king. This idea that there's always a king, that authority passes unbroken from the dead king to his heir. And so there's really this notion that kings were God's anointed. That is to say, they received a sacred endorsement, really, by the church, acting on behalf of God himself, was an idea that had scriptural precedence and antecedents. This idea, and certainly anyone in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period is bound to look at the Bible for justifications. And one of the justifications they found, conveniently, because we always find what we want to see, particularly in the Bible, was that Samuel had anointed King David as the king of Israel, God's chosen people. So that notion that the king was in fact God's anointed is very powerful in the Middle Ages, and one, of course, that kings themselves made full use of in their own propaganda. So eventually, in English coronation ceremonies, the church, represented by the Archbishop of Canterbury, would anoint the king with consecrated oil or chrism, and that is to say, kind of a fragrant oil that would be made sacred or holy by being blessed by a priest in the appropriate ceremonies. So it's important to note, too, that for all of these traditions emphasizing the sanctity of the English crown, and I think a lot of these grew out of similar French traditions across the Channel, there were countervailing, coexisting traditions that seemed to contradict or undercut them. And so there's always this tension in English history between the rights of the monarch and the rights of the subjects, especially powerful subjects. And there was a tradition that was more or less, that might have actually existed, but was certainly successfully resurrected by lawyers in the 17th century, that in the midst of time, in Anglo-Saxon and Germanic traditions, the king had only been the first amongst equals, the primus inter pares. That is, it's a Latin expression, but it really refers to this idea that the king's just the most powerful and important nobleman selected by a group of noblemen, the most worthy of a worthy class. And this idea was that the king had a right, not just the right, but the obligation to consult these noblemen, who were both his vassals, but in some sense also his social equals. And so this notion of divine right that we're familiar with, certainly for the 17th century in continental Europe, to the extent it existed in England, really existed in some of the countervailing traditions of the so-called mixed monarchy. And that is to say, this idea that the king did not rule alone, he ruled in consultation and in combination with the lords and the commons. And that the king was not above the law, but he ruled under the law and enforced the law, according to the famous English common law and unwritten constitutions. Now this is a phrase that's often applied to English governance, and it's one of those really difficult phrases or terms to define, and so hard that I'm just curious if anyone here will take a stab at it, largely because out of sheer cowardice. I prefer not to try to summarize it myself first. But anyone have an idea what this unwritten constitution is? Often compared against the American version of this, which is written down, you know, we the people, so the unwritten constitution of the English government.
Traditions?
Traditions?
Yeah.
Perfect. That's great. Anybody who had the courage to say anything would be rewarded with a perfect. But absolutely, this idea of legal precedents and rulings and royal proclamations, and especially the parliamentary acts. So the English Constitution consists of basically legal precedents. It means it's a mess in some ways, although the English tended to see that favorably, as though it were flexible and sanctioned by tradition. And it's an important point. And the English Parliament is an advisory and a legislative body. It passes laws and it gives advice to the king. It is an increasingly important institution in the 17th century and is really, as it were, feeling its oats when we begin our story in the mid-17th century. But it's also important, I think, to note that from the 14th century on, the English Parliament, specifically the House of Commons, the lower house, consisting of representatives of boroughs and counties, had a right that made them unique in Europe. They had the right to, the veto right, the right to decide on whether or not new taxation could be passed. This didn't seem like a big idea when they were first given this right in order for the king to get easy grants of money fast to fund the 100 Years' War against France. But later, this had great significance. It meant essentially that the House of Commons had the king by the short and curlies, as my vulgar uncle used to say, because it could control the king because it controlled the purse. This became a huge deal in the 17th century. It's also worth pointing out, too, that all these traditions of the king being God's anointed, the divine right of kings, all of this stuff, this is an ideal that sits rather uneasily with the reality in late medieval and early modern England. And this is something, those of you who've studied a bit of English and French history, at least, and Scottish history, would be familiar with this. But in general, the late medieval period was a period of chaos, especially for the aristocracy and the monarchy of England, Scotland, and France alike. And in England, the king, one of the kings, Richard II, is deposed and probably murdered. It's not really sure, but I think the probability is leaning towards murder in 1399. And subsequently, a few generations later, and in large part because of this original murder, the Wars of the Roses break out in England, a war between two factions of the royal family, each wanting the throne. A complicated period and one of near anarchy, in which numerous kings, royal heirs, or claimants to the throne were murdered, executed, or killed in battle. So a very turbulent moment. And in France, too, across the Channel, the early modern period, the 16th century, is marked by all kinds of instability. The French wars of religion. Later on, Henry IV's assassination, by being stabbed by an assassin in 1610. And later on, the Fronde in France. I should have turned off my studies there. Live and learn. I'll just mark that down in my mental notebook. And the Fronde in France, which was similarly an aristocratic revolt period of instability. So this idea that we may have of the past of being somehow more intense than the period that follows it. So if there was an idea of absolutism in 17th century France, 16th and 15th century France must have been really absolutist, is actually not true. It's quite the opposite. So during the 15th, from the late Middle Ages to the 17th century in Europe, we really see a period in which, to paraphrase Shakespeare, the head that wears a crown was rather uneasy. So the Tudor dynasty, and I'm racing through English history, you don't have to worry too much about the details, these are broad strokes. The Tudor dynasty that preceded the Stuarts, who I'm going to talk about today, were surprisingly stable and powerful. And interestingly, all the Tudor monarchs died in their bed. And at this point, I can't resist the lame joke directed at those of you who've watched the Tudors, the series. And if you've watched that, you won't be surprised that they all died in their beds because they spend so much time in bed or in other places horizontal. But in reality, what we're really looking at is a dynasty that sets important precedents and foundations of stability in England. And this is in stark contrast with the dynasty that succeeds them, the Stuarts. The Stuarts came, who were the Stuarts? Anyone know off the top of your head? Where were they from? Scotland. Scotland. They were a bunch of barbarians from north of the border. They had Scottish accents. They probably ate haggis. They were unruly barbarians with an unruly history. And the Stuart dynasty itself, with the W in Scotland and usually the UA in England, had a turbulent past. And indeed, many of the Stuart kings had met violent ends. So James I of Scotland and Henry Stuart, the king consort, the husband of Mary Queen of Scots, were both assassinated. And various Scottish kings, James II, the III, the IV, were killed in battle, while James V died on campaign. And finally, Mary Queen of Scots. Oh, yeah.
Was this happening at the same time in a different area?
Okay, good question. Thank you. This is actually the dynasty that succeeds the Tudors in England. Starts off in Scotland. And their origins do not inspire confidence in the English. And the English have to go, for lack of a Tudor heir, to Scotland for their next king. They see, oh my God, the history of Scotland is filled with this strife and murder and so on. So all of Charles I's ancestors, who we're talking about today, he's the grandson of Mary Queen of Scots, lived in this unruly, violent, and arguably barbaric kingdom. I can say that. My last name is Mackenzie, probably. So yes, and Mary Queen of Scots, the last of the Stuart monarchs before James, we'll talk about it in a second, was forcibly deposed by her own subjects. So we have this tradition, the Stuarts who come from Scotland have this tradition of instability. And so this brings us to our first Stuart monarch of England, and that's James I and VI. The first of England, the sixth of Scotland. And he himself had lived through a very unstable childhood in which he inherited the throne when he was only a baby of several days old, in fact. And his childhood was dominated by various regents and overmighty subjects. He was himself the target of various kidnapping and assassination plots. Several of his regents were murdered or died violent deaths. As an adult, he was constantly paranoid that someone would assassinate him. And even as an adult, he would wear layers and layers of bulky clothing, and it was reputed armor under his clothing. And when he went to bed at night, he would pile things and stacks of things and chairs against his door so no one could break in suddenly without warning. So he was paranoid for a reason. So I mention all this because there's the ideal of kingship as being anointed by God, and the reality of it often being unstable and turbulent and fragile in the medieval and early modern period. So leading to the moment that we're talking about today in the new 17th century. So Charles I's father, James VI of Scotland, who later becomes James I of England in 1603, overcompensated, as it were. He wrote a book celebrating the powers of the king. He wrote, "Kings exercise a manner of resemblance of divine power on earth. They have power of life and death over all their subjects and are accountable to none but God alone." Which was wishful thinking on his part, from a man who had always feared his own subjects. He was trying to build up the glamour of the throne, in part as an exercise in overcompensation. And as we'll see in the 17th century, the story that evolves is one of building conflicts between 17th century English Parliament and the English monarchs. So Parliament wasn't going to put up with a lot of crap from the king. So in many respects, what we see in the 17th century is a building conflict between the new Scottish dynasty that's also ruling in England and a Parliament that feels its own power. I'm not going to talk about the Civil Wars in any detail, and I hope you're not going to get too overwhelmed by this. I wanted to say simply that it's a very bloody and chaotic episode in English history, and it consisted really of three different phases. One, struggle between Parliament and the King, and Parliament had at first as allies the Scots, the Scottish kingdom to the north. And then subsequently, after the defeat of the king in 1646, the king, as we'll talk about in a second, Charles I, starts negotiating secretly with the Scots, who are unhappy with their former allies, and the Scots change sides and fight for the king in what's known as the Second Civil War, which goes on until the execution of the king, which we'll talk about next, and is carried on in the so-called Third Civil War by the king's heir, Charles II. So all of these things are in the broader context. And part of this story, too, is really the conflict between Parliament and Crown. But also, I think, important in the story is our religious components, too, that Parliament and the King disagreed about religious policy in ways which I won't go into in depth, but which are very important, and I'll talk about in a little bit. So, traditional histories, and this is a child's history book from the early 20th century, tended to see the English Civil War as simply a fight between the absolutist tendencies of kings on the one hand and the desires of English Parliament to assert the liberties and laws of the freedom-loving English on the other. So it's a glorious story, but took a happy ending with the wicked, tyrannical king being executed. Although, as we'll see, that it's not as simple as that, and people had mixed feelings about the execution that followed the English Civil Wars. But these traditional histories agree on seeing Charles I as someone who tried to rule without Parliament and spent 11 years of his reign without calling Parliament, what's known as the personal rule. So there's traditional notions of what caused the English Civil War, and I teach a class that spends weeks and weeks on the subject, so I can only glance over this briefly today. Really focus on the way in which this is part of a larger story of English history as progress, and progress in this English context is defined as the rights of Parliament against the arbitrary powers of the Crown. So that all of these watersheds limiting the powers of the Crown from its low point of the Northern Conquest in 1066 are stepping stones towards parliamentary democracy. And so this is a very self-congratulatory narrative of, yay, the British parliamentary system is the best in the world. And unlike those French and Americans, we did things gradually, step by step, without having, too many ugly kinds of revolutions. So part of this tradition really focuses on Parliament. The rise of Parliament and the English Civil Wars is part of this story of progress. It's a necessary story and a necessary transition. And again, don't want you to worry too much about the details, but it's worth noting too that not just 19th and early 20th century liberals who were congratulating themselves on how great British parliamentary democracy was, saw the story of the Civil War as part of the story of progress, but also later Marxist scholars who saw everything about class struggle and the rise of first the middle class and later the proletariat, also saw the English Civil War as something that was inevitable and preordained, necessary, and in fact something that paved the way towards social and political and economic modernization. So all traditional views it as a good thing. It had to happen. More recently, and this is something we'll talk more about today, more recently, a school of thought known as the revisionist school has focused on the extent to which this is not an inevitable process, that the English Civil War wasn't preordained, that things could have gone differently. And in fact, the causes of the English Civil War were not necessarily deep-rooted and structural, socioeconomic forces beyond individual control, but were rather the result of various historical accidents and contingencies. And you're probably familiar with the approach that it's more about high politics and important people and their decisions than it is about, class struggle or other kind of deep structural forces. And personalities and contingency, like things could have gone differently if somebody did something else. If Cleopatra's nose were just a bit longer, things would have been entirely different, are part of this revisionist school of thought. And the focus, of course, is on the personality of one man, Charles I, the man who has the dubious distinction of being the only English king executed by Parliament. So his personality is often cited as a decisive factor in the English Civil War, as we'll see. And I'm not sure how many of you have preconceived notions about the English Civil War. Some of you may have English or Scottish parents or grandparents and have some kind of genetic predisposition for one side or the other. But this is one of the questions that I want you to think about, is what side would you be on? Would you be against the king, or would you be against Parliament, or for the king or for Parliament? Or would you kind of try to wait it out and see which side was likely to win, or who would give you the most advantage? So there's all sorts of different questions you might want to ask yourself. So Charles was in many respects an unlikely king, and in fact, he was not the eldest son, he was the second son, and the expected heir to the throne, his older brother, Prince Henry, was this dashing, charming prince that everyone thought showed great promise. So he's this immensely popular young man whose death at the age of 18 from typhoid fever really prostrated the country with grief. So Charles was not trained, not raised to be a king, and temperamentally, he was actually unsuited for the role. He was shy. He was also unprepossessing physically. He was not an impressive figure of a man. He was, and it's very, he was reported to be quite short, anywhere from 5'1", 5'3", or 4 or 5. And if you're a fan of Monty Python, you may have heard the Oliver Cromwell song, which talks about Charles I beginning his reign at 5'6" and ending it at 4'8". And so he was actually short even before losing his head, but that, of course, doesn't help. Charles was also a shy man who seemed to have suffered from a speech impediment, a stutter, which made him dislike public appearances and speeches. And he had really very little gift for the gab, very little social skills. He was shy. He tended to be a private man. He tended to be a man dependent on the advice of 1 or 2 or 3 very close friends and counselors. Unfortunately for him, those close friends and counselors were seen by many as a bad influence, who were trying to rule without Parliament, to trying to find sneaky, shady ways to resurrect ancient medieval laws so that they could raise taxes without passing them through Parliament. So Charles's personality, the friends that he had, his favorites, were a problem that became increasingly pressing. He had many qualities which were unlikely to be appreciated by his contemporaries, but which we, I think, can sympathize with a little bit. He was a loving husband and a devoted family man who had 6 children surviving infancy, raised in a close and affectionate household. He was devoted to his wife, Henrietta Maria, the daughter of Henry IV of France, the sister of Louis XIII of France. And you know, this is a period in which a man who's faithful to his wife and a good father, these aren't necessarily the qualities people value in a king, sadly. Although these domestic qualities we might value today. Unfortunately, his devotion to his wife was seen as a weakness by many. His devotion to a wife who was not only French, but who was also Roman Catholic. It was a serious liability for the English public who viewed Catholics as a kind of potential fifth column, potential traitors, and even terrorists who tried to blow up the Houses of Parliament in 1605, who were traditional enemies of the English since the Reformation. So she gave the king advice that didn't help him much with his subjects either. When he asked what he could do to deal with Parliament, she would say, "Charles, be a king," meaning just do what you want and get your pesky subjects under control. And so, in many respects, his devotion to his wife really backfired. And I'm not going to talk about the English Civil War in any detail. Suffice it to say that, as I mentioned, it ends in 1646 with a victory for Parliament and the king is taken as prisoner. And this poses a bit of a problem for the victors who start to disagree amongst themselves about various issues about government and church, but also what to do with the king, who's a prisoner and a hot potato. So, as I mentioned, the king continues to secretly negotiate and cause problems, and he manages to get his Scottish subjects to change sides. And this leads to the outbreak of what's known as the Second Civil War, in which the peace is broken and hostilities are revived and more blood is spilled. And this outbreak of the so-called Second Civil War convinces many that Charles I is a man that cannot be relied upon, that he's a man of bad faith with whom you cannot negotiate. And Oliver Cromwell, who is at this point the leader of his enemies, describes Charles as so great a dissembler, a liar, somebody who pretends to think and say things that they don't believe, and so false a man that he was not to be trusted. He was, moreover, a man against whom the Lord hath witnessed. Providence had spoken. Because the royalists had been defeated, that meant that God was for Cromwell and not for Charles. We'll talk about which side God was on in a second, because it's not as simple, obviously, as Cromwell might have wanted to think. So, this is, and here we have Charles I in later life in a suit of armor, being completely noble. This is where a more recent approach to explaining the English Civil War is interesting and important. One which emphasizes religion and political beliefs as playing a significant role. Because people, it wasn't just accident the Civil War broke out, an accident of personality. People really did have different discernible political and religious opinions and objectives. That there really was something at stake that was being fought over. And Charles I's critics really believed that the king, listening to his Catholic wife, was trying to reform the Church of England closer to Catholicism, that there was a danger of return to Catholicism. Whereas Puritan critics wanted the church to be further reformed to a more Calvinist, continental Protestant model. And it's interesting, too, to look in this context that Charles I thought that God was on his side. He thought that he was defending the Church of England against its enemies, Puritans, who were trying to destroy it. That it was his job to pass down intact not only the crown of England, but the Church of England, of which he is the head. Because the monarchs of England are since the English Reformation, under Henry VIII, the heads of the church, as unlikely a thing as that may seem. So it's also important to note that Charles had every opportunity to run off to France, to escape, to negotiate terms, to abdicate, but he refused. He, to some degree, I know it's not hard to see from here, to some degree, he chose the role of martyr that was subsequently thrust upon him. And here's where I often make a joke about, have you ever taken a career aptitude test? And it would probably tell you something terrifying, like you should be a florist or something like that, something you never thought of. But I often think that if Charles took one, he wouldn't have got king or statesman or a CEO. He would have likely got martyr. That's what you should do. Be a martyr, because this is really what played to his strengths, as we'll see. And so he had determined by 1648 that he was going to go down with his ship. That, like any other nobleman, he was determined to bequeath the Church of England and the Crown of England undivided and to his son. And so, like any other landowner, he wanted to give his land intact to his heir. And he was a problem for his enemies. Here's this guy that you have as a prisoner, and he's distinct. And it's really hard to know what to do with him. So all the victors of the English Civil War are divided. The moderate element, known as the Presbyterians, this is where it gets really confusing, but the moderates want to continue negotiating with the king. They can't envisage a state without a king. Cromwell, the Puritans, and the more radical elements in Parliament and in the army want to try the king for treason. Now, what's the problem with trying the king for treason? Any logical problem that springs to mind about that? Yeah? No evidence? And what is treason? Going against the king. Yeah. So treason is defined in medieval law as an act against the king. And so this idea that you could try the king for treason against himself was cheap, to say the least. But as we'll see, very important legally, setting a very important legal precedent. This idea that you could separate the person of the king from the state was in fact very bold and sets an important precedent. So various of the king's enemies begin to refer to him as Charles Stuart, that man of blood. And how is this a way of attacking him? When you say Charles Stuart, that man of blood, what are you really trying to say?
He's Scottish.
He's Scottish. Charles Stuart, I mean, what do you usually call, if you were to say the Queen, would you say Mrs. Windsor? No. She's kind of, she's Elizabeth Regina. She's the Queen. The King and the Queen doesn't really have a last name. There's a family name, but they don't really have a last name. Calling Charles Stuart is like tagging his last name on. And as you most rightly point out, it's also a reminder, hey, this guy's Scottish. He's not even English. He's a foreigner. And you know what the English think of foreigners, or if you don't know, you can guess. Also, calling him a man of blood, and this is really the theme that I'm going to continue with, is important too, because holding Charles responsible for the bloodshed in the English Civil Wars was a way of desacralizing him, of stripping the king of his sacred persona, of seeing that he was a man who had sinned beyond redemption. And this was a very powerful belief in early modern thought, this idea of blood guilt. And the story of blood guilt and this notion of blood crying out to God for vengeance is found in very early on in the Bible, in Genesis, when Cain kills his brother, Abel. And I'm sure you remember this story, regardless of what kind of religious background, if any, you have. You will have heard of this, in any case, in the famous line, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and slew him out of jealousy, but that's a different story. And our Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel thy brother?" And Cain famously answers, "I know not. Am I my brother's keeper?" It's kind of lame excuse. And God says, "What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth out to me out of the earth." And this is a very powerful image, but also a belief that blood unjustly spilled in murder actually called out to God for vengeance. And that this blood had to be avenged, or else God would be angry, and that anger would be taken out on the entire nation. And this is a constant theme of pamphlets about murders, was that murder was always out, as of course you know from Macbeth, and that that God would always bring murderers to justice, and that his vengeance would always fall upon those who had unjustly spilled blood. which is a very strong and pervasive theme in the literature of the period. And it's also believed that if the king or the godly magistrate did not make sure that murder was punished, then God's anger would be inflicted on the whole country. And instead of global warming in this period, instead of man-made climatic disasters, what they have is the hand of God, usually upset about murders and other things, and heresy and so on, idolatry, smiting the people with floods, fires, and so on. This is very much a theme of the cheap print of the era, was that God was punishing those who did not avenge sins. Sins had to be expiated and avenged. And murder was the most serious sin. So, accusing Charles of murder was an attempt to desacralize him. And so political events moved swiftly. In December the 5th, 1648, what's known as Pride's Purge takes place. And this is an army colonel who was a radical Puritan, stood outside the doors of Parliament and with a bunch of soldiers and drawn swords, mind you, excluding a list of members that they knew were moderates and wanted to vote for continuing negotiations with the king. Conversely, they would let anyone in who wasn't on this list, and they would arrest people who were on the list. And a lot of people saw the commotion and decided, gee, got this estate in the countryside that really needs my attention right now. Maybe I'll just take a few weeks off. So a lot of people just made discretion the better part of valor and left. And this is the moment at which things radicalized quickly. So the House of Commons, which had numbered about 500 people at the beginning of the English Civil War, now numbered 80 people, 80 radical Puritans, most of them ready to take a hardline approach to the King of England. And that, and this small core of, shall we say, radicals voted through an act ordering the trial of the king. Now, an act to become law has to have the assent of the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and the King of England. This one, the House of Lords had kind of fallen apart and no longer existed. House of Commons was a fragment of its former self, known often pejoratively as the rump, meaning just a small remnant, and the worst part, the rear end part. And also the fact that the king, of course, did not assent to this law, made people question whether or not it was legally valid. All kinds of radical Republicans tried to make an argument, amongst them John Milton of Paradise Lost fame, tried to argue that, in fact, the king was answerable to the law and that throughout all history, the people had a right to call tyrants to justice if they had committed crimes against their own people. A radical modern idea that actually speaks to us powerfully today, but I think was one that was held by a small minority in this period. So the trial of Charles I was conducted under a cloud. A lot of people disapproved. They said, wait a minute, the king is a member of the House of Lords. Why isn't the House of Lords trying him? He should be tried by his peers. They said that the act that agreed to his trial was illegal, that the Parliament was not a real Parliament. But yet, Cromwell and his allies decided to try the king. And this is a big question. I mean, if you were Cromwell, is this what you would do? I mean, why try the king? Wouldn't it be better if the king fell down the stairs and broke his neck? Or if he was shot trying to escape? Or if he had some sort of apoplexy, some sort of fit and died? Why try the king for treason?
To make people who were supporting him scared of him?
So, yeah, to show that you are not afraid to cross that line, to really radicalize people.
Couldn't it also be a way of making his line of family not...
Absolutely, that's a really good point. And this was a question that was people were asking. They were saying, okay, so we get rid of this king. Does his son become king? So you're right. I think that was one way of attacking directly the monarch. And yeah.
To show that the king isn't above parliament.
Yes, and I think though all these things are true, and I love the way you gave them to me in ascending order, but I would say the last one is that the symbolic, it was a way of Parliament to say, we are the law. The king is not above the law, we are the law, we are the people. And so it's great, and I get excited about this. I'm actually kind of a parliamentarian at heart. But an interesting and radical argument that many people at the time thought didn't wash. And this is where maybe accidents and personality do come into it again, is that for some reason, and it's interesting, Charles showed to his best advantage at his trial. He had never in his life been a better, more effective public speaker. Contemporaries noted, and they attached great significance to this, that the king had lost his stutter. The king who could not speak suddenly had lost his stutter. So they thought, ooh, God is on his side, or many people did. And what's interesting, too, is that this is reported from the point of view of Parliament and the king's enemies. And the whole shorthand account of the trial, which I make my students read parts of, is taken down pretty accurately by the king's enemies. And yet it's hard to imagine a more sympathetic portrayal, a portrayal sympathetic to the king, who comes across as sensible, rational, and he casts himself as not a tyrant, but rather a defendant who's trying to defend the rights of his own people against the tyranny of an unjust authority. He says, I see no authority here. I see no parliament. This is not a parliament. This is not a justly assembled body. He said, there are many authorities in this world, and some of them are unjust. There are authorities like highway robbers that take your purse on the road. But that is not a just authority. And he said, this is an authority without any legal foundation. And so when his enemies said, well, you know, the monarchy of England has been elected, he said, what? He said, the monarchy of England has been hereditary for these last 1,000 years. And nobody could dispute that because he was factually in the right. So the king, who sat through the proceedings stubbornly wearing his hat, refusing to defer to the tribunal, and in fact refusing even to enter a plea, but simply arguing against the authority of the tribunal, which he saw as illegal. So ultimately, I think the decision to report this trial and to even have it is seen, I think, by most scholars and almost all contemporaries as a huge mistake. And in fact, there were hecklers in the audience and people screaming that it was unjust. And a woman in the audience, who turned out to be the wife of one of the parliamentary generals, started a huge kerfuffle saying that Oliver Cromwell was a traitor and that the king, that the tribunal did not represent the people of England, was carried out kicking and screaming from the house. And one of the guards, one of the soldiers, actually was going to fire and kill her, but luckily he was restrained. So it's a bit chaotic. The regicide, of course, the verdict known without any doubt. The verdict was entered as guilty. He was guilty of treason against his own people. He was executed on the 30th of January. It was a cold day, and so Charles I asked for an extra sweater to wear on the day of his execution because he was afraid that if he shivered for fear, or for cold, rather, people would believe that he was shivering out of fear. And he knew that this was the ultimate moment, the ultimate performance of his life, and that he had to play the part of the martyr convincingly, and that if he betrayed fear or uncertainty, then people would think his cause was unjust. As it was, he died very calmly, with no appearance of fear, making many people think that God might be supporting him under his ordeals and his trials. Very interesting, too, and I think that this is also something to emphasize, was that the moment his head was chopped off, when a traitor's head is chopped off, it's true. Sadly, I know all about this stuff. The executioner is supposed to hold up the head and say, "This is the head of a traitor," which he did, and people are supposed to cheer, like, "Yay, traitor dead." But instead, there was this terrible, terrible silence because people were stunned and fearful, not knowing what would happen. And one eyewitness writes that apart from a song, that really after the king's head was brandished, there was just a very universal groan that was terrible to all the beholders and the ear witnesses. So many people believed that perhaps the Rump Parliament had gone too far. Here's a contemporary print illustrating that Cromwell, by chopping down, by killing the king, had chopped down the tree of monarchical authority, but taking with it all things sacred. The parliamentary statutes, Magna Charta, the Great Charter, the Bible, the coat of arms of the king, and so on. So this was too radical. And interestingly, there was an absolute revival of royalist sentiment. All sorts of people changed sides after the execution of the king. Charles I becomes an instant martyr in popular eyes. According to one scholar, unlike Christ, Charles rose on the first day. So almost immediately after his execution, broadsides, ballads, pamphlets were published, celebrating his courage, celebrating his God-given stoicism and cheerfulness. And accounts like these proliferated. A woman dipping her handkerchief in the blood of the king, which miraculously cured her of a disease that had plagued her for years. And this disease was known as scrofula. It was popular. It was a tubercular disorder that it was popularly believed only the king could cure, and that the touch of the king could cure. So the Icon Basilica, which is the frontispiece of which is on the back of your lecture outline, was published within days of the king's execution and was a runaway bestseller. It went through 35 editions within 1 year at a very steep price for the period, 35 shillings, which was a lot of money. But yet, people would buy it in any form. There were even verse editions, poem editions, and editions set to music that sold like hotcakes. And this publication purported to be the king's own version of events of the Civil War, including his pious meditations, reflections, and prayers while awaiting execution and trial. And in these prayers and meditations, he forgave his enemies. And this was a very critical part of this mythology of Charles the Martyr. And we see here the very unambiguous, unsubtle imagery as well. We see Charles I renouncing his worldly throne, inspired by the word of God, a little nudge to those who accuse me of being a Catholic, is very Protestant emphasis on the Bible. Seeing his heavenly crown of glory in the sky, he grasps at the crown of thorns of the martyr. And Charles's resemblance to Jesus is a little bit worked up there as well. I mean, it's definitely Charles, but a Jesus-y Charles, and so not terribly subtle in any way. This account showed Charles as a grieving and suffering husband and father, as well as a mistreated, a misunderstood king. So he loves his people, forgives his people, but he also has these infant children that he visits in prison. He also separated from his wife and his youngest child. So all sorts of very maudlin and sentimental themes are invoked. And most importantly, Charles tells his children to forgive their enemies. He also gives them practical advice. He tells his youngest son, don't let them make you king. Your older brothers should be king first, not you. He's giving him